Namaste.
Namaste, everybody. Jai Shri Krishna.
Yes.
So, we last did chapter 2 up to verse 59. And if you remember in the previous session, 53, we did up to verse 53. No?
Yeah.
And if we remember, Shri Krishna was talking to us about the equanimity of the intellect, which we will find he stresses all the way through the Gita. And specifically, he mentions having an intellect which can overcome, he says, the quicksand of illusion. And we went into why he uses the comparison to quicksand and the importance of that. And he then also mentions the importance of the equanimity of the intellect in order for us to progress. So now he continues in verses 54 of the Gita, and let's see what he now says, and he is going to explain more in answer to a question Arjuna is about to ask.
Verse 54. Arjuna uvacha sthita pragyasya ka bhasha samadhisthasya keshava sthitadhih kim prabhasheta kimasita vrajeta kim. Now Arjuna is asking, Sthita Pragya. Sthita Pragya means whose intellect is steady. Ka bhasha, how they speak or how they talk, how they look like. Samadhisthasya Keshava. Keshava is the name of Krishna, who has killed the demon called Keshi. That's why Krishna's name is Keshava. He says that, hey Keshava, how this steady-minded or steady intellect person, the disposition or how they talk. Then he says, Thitadhi kim prabhashyata, how they appear, how they look alike. Kimasita, how they sit. Kim vrajeta, how they talk. So, how they walk. So, Arjuna is asking that, what is their appearance physically, that how can I recognize them, that the way they talk, the way they walk. So these are the three questions he's asking in one, that how they look alike, or how they talk, or how they walk.
So Arjuna says, O killer of the Keshi demon, Kesha, what is the disposition of one who is situated in the knowledge of his or her own self? How does an enlightened person behave? How does he sit? How does he walk? Essentially, Arjuna is asking, well, how will I recognize such a person? Remember in the previous verses, Bhagavan has talked about somebody with a very steady intellect. So he's saying, yes, but how will I recognize such a person who has reached that very steady intellect and has reached that equanimity of mind? Is there something different about the way they sit, the way they walk, the way they talk, the way they comport themselves, in other words? Now, we are all the same externally. We have skin, we have two eyes, a nose, two ears, lips. But a person who understands and has got equanimity of mind will be quite different inside. There's nothing necessarily externally different about them. But given that the difference is internal, Arjuna is saying, well, in that case, how am I going to recognize the person? Now, in most versions of the Gita and interpretations of the Gita, Arjuna's question is taken as being rhetorical. I mean, sitting and walking, he says. They're not to be taken, these questions, literally. However, research today shows our speech consists of very intricate acoustic patterns, sound patterns, which affect how we are seen in terms of our personality, our emotional state, and even our professional competence. So, for example, a melodious voice gives the impression of a cultivated person. So, thousands of years after Arjuna's question, based on the analysis of several million audio files, input from thousands of recruiters and US consumers, a company called Jobline, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, has created a technology which can predict how a person's voice will make the listener feel. It is apparently 75% accurate, and so we can see that Arjun's question, asked thousands of years ago, was not necessarily or entirely rhetorical. Then further studies in body language show that calm people who respect others, when they sit, give others their space. They don't try to crowd them. Their muscles are relaxed and loose. And there are 2 studies which show that. People who are calm people themselves relax others immediately. They generally move at a slightly slower pace to allow others to keep up. And this was a publication by Aniko, A-N-I-K-O, if anybody wants to look it up, Dunn, a psychologist. So now, to this not rhetorical question, let's listen to Bhagavan's reply.
Verse number 55. Sri Bhagavan uvacha prajahati yada kaman sarvan partha manogatan atmanyevatmana tushtaha sthita prajnastadochyate. So now Bhagavan is answering that which or whom you call sthita prajnaha, that means whose intellect is steady. Bhagavan says, prajahati yada kaman. Yada means when, kaman is desires. Prajahati means renouncing. Bhagavan says when the desires have renounced his. Sarvan manogatan is that all those desires which has come from mind. Then Bhagavan says that Atmani eva Atmana tushtaha. The person himself is satisfied by itself. Then Bhagavan says Sthita prajna tadochyate. That time the person becomes steady intellect or beyond intellect. So now this is very beautiful answer which is given by Bhagavan. When Arjun is asking that how they look or how they behave, how they talk, how they walk, Bhagavan says that is again the external. Bhagavan again is going internal. He says no. They're all desires from mind. Whatever the desires have come from mind, he says they have renounced all those desires and they are satisfied by themselves. Those people called sthita prajna, means steady intellect.
So Sri Krishna says, Bhagavan says, O Parth, when one strongly rejects all desires for sense objects made by the mind, and the person is satisfied in the self, such a person is said to have a steady intellect. So, as Juniji correctly says, Bhagavan goes straight from the externals to the internals. So he's saying, look at the person's mind, which will be reflected now in their behavior. So again, let's break down Bhagavan's response, which is actually quite detailed. He says the person has strongly rejected all desires for sense objects. So the first thing we should note here is that Bhagavan does not say that we should not use any sense objects. Obviously, we need to have a roof over our head. We need water. We need food, without which our bodies that we inhabit would die. If we're visiting any planet, this one or any other makes no difference, there are certain necessities on that planet which we will need for our bodies to survive. That may vary planet by planet, but clearly there will be things that on each planet we will need. And Bhagavan is not saying that we should somehow kill ourselves or commit suicide by not using those. Nor is he saying we should not enjoy a sense object. The point he's making is that we should not hanker after different sense objects. Not that if we have it, we shouldn't enjoy it. But he's saying our mind should not be attached to it and hankering after it. And we should not be working with the sole purpose of getting more and more sense objects, is what he's saying here. So he's saying if you are offered a rasgulla, he's not saying don't eat it and enjoy it. But he's saying equally don't hanker after 20 of them and consume 20 of them, which is self-control. It's also useful to bear in mind a point he brings out here is that our desire for all objects, in fact, the entire universe, is only a product of our consciousness. The universe exists and is reflected in our consciousness. And if we go back to verse 53, we've explained that there. Because the only reality is our consciousness, sense objects are only there for what? To support us while we are living on a planet. They have no other purpose. Certainly we should use them. Certainly we can even enjoy them. But always bearing that they have no reality, in fact. And if you remember in chapter 2, earlier in this chapter, we showed that basically even a particle, a molecule, an atom, does not exist until there is an observer. That's what I mean by everything exists within our consciousness when there is an observer. And we should bear that in mind, that this all exists because of me. But it's truly a rare individual who has overcome all desires. So when we pass, we do a puja over 13 days. That's when we pass away from the planet. Because we understand that just because a person has passed doesn't mean that his or her desires have passed. And maybe Giniji would like to explain that in more detail. So what we're doing is we're giving time for the person to separate from the desires they had in their life just before they passed. And maybe you'd like to explain that further.
Yes, actually, I think I remember. The 13th day, usually the ritual says that, it says that when somebody doesn't have part of body, that doesn't mean they don't have desire of that part. So if somebody doesn't have eyes, that doesn't mean that they don't want to see, or somebody doesn't have ears. So same way, if they don't have part of body, that doesn't mean they don't have desires for that part of body. Same way, if that Atma doesn't have, Jivatma doesn't have body, that doesn't mean that Jivatma doesn't have desire to live with that body. So the puja or whatever the rituals we have on the 13th day, we try to do the rituals to fulfill those desires by offering something which we call pindam. So by offering certain things and just requesting that Atma that we are trying to fulfill your desires and now please transit to another body. So yeah, so that is the prayers which we have on 13th day.
Yeah, and that's interesting. What we're saying, what Giniji is saying is because we have passed, whatever desires we have left do not necessarily disappear. In fact, they don't disappear. And it is those desires which will bring us back to a planet. And Bhagavan will come to that again in later chapters in considerable detail. Then he makes a very interesting remark about desires. They're made by the mind, he says. The wording he's chosen is very interesting because in verse 53, we discuss the theory of biocentrism, which I just mentioned a minute ago, which is that the universe didn't create us. It's our consciousness that created the universe. It's within our consciousness that the universe exists. He's now reiterating, Bhagavan is reiterating, that similarly your desires, which are not, it's not a material object, it's a thought. Your thoughts are also created, he's saying, by yourself, our mind. So when we're not in control of our mind will create one desire after another desire after another desire. The desires are endless. Why is that? Let's look at it from a biological or science perspective. What happens? I have eyes. I'm looking at a camera right now. My eyes feed back to the brain, oh, I'm looking at a camera. It's a very nice camera. I like that camera. What does the brain now say? Oh, I want that camera. Desire is created immediately, and that applies to literally anything we look at. The brain looks at it, the brain analyzes it, and it sets up immediate likes and dislikes, desires and aversions. And that's what Bhagavan is now saying, that your mind is what is responsible for creating the desires which are binding you. So he then says, how do we achieve this control? He will leave that to later questions from Arjun. He's not right now telling us how do we control it. He's simply telling us the facts, that it's your mind that is creating the desires. Then he says the person is satisfied in the self. Now remember from verse 52, I mentioned a professor, Kostas Skenderis, who describes the universe as a hologram. Our scriptures describe the world as being, Anjani, do you say?
Mrigatrishna.
Yeah. Meaning a mirage seen by a deer in a desert or wherever. Now we can see this description given thousands of years ago. It's not very different to the description today of a hologram, which is what is a hologram? Essentially, it's a mirage. 3D mirage, but it's a mirage. In other words, by mirage, I mean it's not real. So in the desert, what happens? A deer sees a mirage of water. It's desperately thirsty, and it thinks it sees water. It runs towards the water to quench its thirst, poor thing, but each time it nears a mirage, what happens? The mirage disappears. But the deer never actually understands there's nothing other than the mirage, and therefore constantly chases after it. We are not actually terribly different to that deer.
Right.
Because we look at one sense object after another, never actually understanding that no matter how many sense objects we have, they will never truly satisfy us. We will simply go after more. And again, we can look back at verses 52 and 53. But a wise person, just like if there was a wise deer, understands and ceases to run after it, understanding that this will never satisfy me, this will never make me happy, and in fact the object itself exists only in my own consciousness. Now there are some phenomenal 3D holograms you can watch on YouTube. There was one, if you look it up, which was some kind of department store or mall, shopping mall in Dubai, and there were whales, panda bears, monkeys, leopards, anything else. You can look at it on the internet. The whole is a complete illusion, but they were wonderful images. So Bhagavan is telling us this whole universe is an illusion, and science is telling us the same thing. It is as much created by us as the holograms in the link that you could get by looking up YouTube, what I just mentioned. Now, the person who fully understands this fact is therefore situated in the self. What does that mean? In her own Atma, or consciousness. Knowing is the only real thing that exists. Nothing else truly exists. Again, Bhagavan will expand on this in considerable detail in chapter 9. He then says such a person is said to have a steady intellect. So when we fully understand these facts and we remain steady in that knowledge, without forgetting it, and we can base our behavior and our choices and actions on these facts, then he says, your intellect is steady. Now, finally, we should note something that always astonishes me, that even being Bhagavan, he has absolutely no ego. He does not say, it is so, I say so, therefore it's true. He says, it is said. And therefore we understand that Bhagavan agrees with it. It's an astonishing level of humility. So he's given Arjun, you can see, a lot of pointers to recognize the person, not because of any physical appearance of sitting and walking, but by the person's choices and actions. That's, he says, how you will recognize the person of a steady intellect. Verse 56.
Dukheshvanudignamanaha sukheshu vigataspruhaha vitaragabhayakrodhaha sthitadhir muniruchyate. So in previous verse, Bhagavan used word sthita prajnaha, which Arjun asked three different words. When he asked the question, he used three different words. One is sthita prajna, second is samadhistha, and third is sthita dhihi. So in previous verse 55, Bhagavan answered about sthita prajna, against steady intellect. In these also, Arjuna has used different words. So Bhagavan is also answering in different, but the meaning is very same. But what Arjuna has asked the question, same word Bhagavan is using and giving answer. So that is again beautifully Bhagavan is explaining here. He said, Dukheshu anudvignamanaha. Dukheshu means in sorrow or in pain or in dislikes. Anudvignamanaha. udvigna mana means agitated mind. Anudvigna manaha means whose mind is not agitated in dukheshu, in pain or in sorrow. Sukheshu vigata spruhaha. Sukheshu means in happiness or in joy. Vigata spruhaha. Whose desires or whose likes or desires are vigataha. Vigataha means who has overcome to that. Now Bhagavan says vitaraga bhayakrodha. So these three words which we have to understand very well because these are beautiful words. Bhagavan is saying first word is raga. Raga means desires. Bhaya is fear. And krodha which is anger. Vita means who has overcome to these three. Raga again desires. Bhaya is fear. And krodha means anger. Now these three represents of tense also. So as we say is that raga represents of future tense. It represents of future. Because we have desires for our future. Bhaya, fear is always in present. And krodha because of past. So Bhagavan is talking about this, by using these three words, he's saying that the person whose mind or intellect is steady, that person doesn't care of even present, future or past, who always lives in the moment. So vitaraga bhayakrodha means who has overcome to the desires, fear and anger. Then Bhagavan says, thitadihi muni uchyate. That person has steady intellect. So this is beautiful verse.
All his verses are beautiful.
Absolutely.
Every word carries so much meaning.
Exactly.
You could write a book on every word, yeah?
Exactly.
So Bhagavan says now, one whose mind remains undisturbed amidst that which they dislike, who does not crave for that which they like, and who is free from attachment, fear and anger, is called a person who has overcome their mind. So he's now giving Arjun further characteristics of such a person. So in our scriptures, the definition of sukh is that which we like. Dukh is that which we dislike. And again, as Jiniji says, we should note the precision and logic with which he speaks, because each of these relates to different things. Rag relates to wants, which generally relates to the future. We have wants for the future. Bhaya is fear, generally arises because of something that's happened in our past, which has made us fearful of something that could happen now again in the future. So you have an accident on a bridge, and so every time you come to a bridge, you say, oh, I could have another accident. Yeah. Something might fall on me, or whatever happened on that bridge. Anger can also be the present. It can also arise because of future wants are thwarted, because of something that happened in the past. So anger combines both past and future. Something could have happened in the past, which is making us angry when we think about it. It could also relate to the future. We know that something we want, we will be thwarted from getting, and so we get angry. So Bhagavan has combined past, present, future. But again, we need to break down Bhagavan's words to really understand them, because he's continuing to describe such a person. He then says, one whose mind remains undisturbed amidst that which they dislike. This is actually probably one of the most difficult. Right. Because to some extent, we can remain calm people. When something nice happens, we can say, okay, we won't get elated, we won't jump for joy. That actually is the easier one to achieve. This is actually the most difficult, that something comes in your life which you dislike, you didn't want to happen. Can you remain undisturbed? Now, again, he doesn't say that if we have a disease, which all of us will dislike, we shouldn't feel the pain. He's not saying that if a loved one has passed, we shouldn't miss them or their company. He's not saying any of these things. He's merely saying that the mind, however, remains undisturbed, meaning that it remains calm in distress or trauma. There's a paper called Calming Trauma, How Understanding the Brain Can Help. It's published by researchers Dawn McClelland and Chris Gilead. And they set out their findings, which I'm going to read to you, which are very interesting for this verse. When a person experiences something traumatic, adrenaline and other neurochemicals rush to the brain. and print a picture there. The traumatic memory loops in the emotional side of the brain, disconnecting from the part of the brain that conducts reasoning and cognitive processing. So it basically separates it, which is why we feel the emotion. They continue. When a person experiences a traumatic event, adrenaline rushes through the body, and the memory is imprinted into the amygdala. You remember the two little almond-shaped clusters of cells behind your eyes, which is part of the limbic system. Now, listeners may remember what happens to the amygdala from chapter 2, verse 4, when the brain receives such a shock. We saw what was happening to Arjun. One of the effects is to cut off access to our prefrontal cortex. In other words, we can no longer think clearly anymore. What's the solution? The problem is to actually bring oxygen and blood flow back to the brain to calm the body and access the higher regions of the brain, which have, remember, become isolated. Bhagwan will deal with how to do this in later chapters, but for now, let's simply say that science identifies the same problem. Bhagwan's therefore again referring to the mind of one who has learned to do this, remain calm. In other words, they do not allow the reasoning and the higher centers of the brain to become disconnected from the emotional centers of the brain. They've trained their brain not to do that. Right now, Bhagwan is not telling Arjun or us how to do this. He is merely answering Arjun's question, how do I recognize a person who has this knowledge and understanding and who has achieved that level where, despite trauma, the brain, the reasoning part of the brain, will remain connected at all times to the emotional part of the brain. And therefore, they will not have that kind of trauma. Then he says, one who does not crave for that which they like. In other words, the person is not likely to be a party goer. Person will not constantly crave pleasure and fun, is likely to be much more seriously inclined. That doesn't mean the person doesn't have fun. It's just that their definition of fun will be different. Then he says they're free from attachment, fear, and anger. Now, freedom from attachment refers to freedom from constantly wanting to carry out actions for the sake of specific results. The actions of such a person, Bhagwan says, instead, will be geared towards what they're required to do because of their profession or other duties. It may be your duty as a mother, as a father, as a brother, as a cousin. But they will do what is required of them to do, irrespective of whether it is in their interest to do it or it is not in their interest to do it. That's not something that will have any bearing on the person. The person's also free from fear. So knowing what they are not fearful of different outcomes because they recognize we do not necessarily know whether a particular outcome is good for us or bad. Remember in verse 50, we went into the 12,442 factors that affect us by the time we're just 12 years old, never mind when we're 20, 30, 40. And we said that no matter how clever we are, no matter what algorithm we set up, we really cannot predict what an outcome will be. So the person understanding that and having a calm mind doesn't keep on fearing different outcomes because they know that they're also not in a position to judge whether an outcome is good or bad. We may think an outcome is bad. It may be for our own benefit. We don't know that. They're also free from the emotion of anger, knowing it serves no useful function other than increasing our blood pressure. In other words, it's very detrimental to physical health and any spiritual development. So the person's free from anger. The uncontrolled anger affects health, is well established. Everybody knows that today, I think. However, anger also clouds our judgment and our decision-making capability. When we are angry, our brain cannot think straight. It cannot weigh possible choices. It cannot even weigh, am I doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Will what I'm doing benefit somebody or will it actually be detrimental to the person? So all these factors which enable us to decide right from wrong, our duty from what is not our duty and we shouldn't do, we cannot access those higher regions of the brain, and so we're not in a position to judge. Now, for those who want the detail, there's a very lengthy paper. Again, you can Google it. Fuel in the fire. How anger impacts judgment and decision making. Now, a person with these characteristics, which Bhagavan has just described, is a person with steady wisdom, he says. 57.
57. Yas sarvatra nabhisnehas tat tat prapya shubha shubham na bhinandati nadveshti tasya pragya pratisthita. Bhagavan says, Yaha is the person, sarvatra, everywhere, anabhisneha. Abhisneha is which is attached. The person who is unattached or not attached, tat tat prapya shubha shubham. Bhagavan says, tat tat prapya, whatever they gets, shubha or ashubham, which is auspicious, which is likes, ashubham, which is inauspicious or dislikes. Na abhinandati, not they, neither they be happy, na dvishti, nor they dvishti or jealous or negative mind. So na abhinandati, not even they feel happy, or na dveshti, nor they feel jealous or unhappiness. Bhagavan says, whatever they gaze, their mind stays steady. Tasya pragya pratisthita. The person's intellect is steady. So whatever they get in their way, Bhagavan says their intellect is always steady.
Bhagavan, of course, is continuing to describe the person, and he says, one who remains unaffected, without affection literally, in all mindsets, is neither positive in good fortune, nor negative in circumstances one does not like. He is a person who has fixed, stable, permanent knowledge. So once more, Bhagavan is continuing to help Arjuna and ourselves to recognize such a person. Now, Bhagavan uses a word here, anabhisneha, yeah? Now, Janiji explained, and maybe you'd like to, that sneha is the type of love, and maybe you should explain this in Sanskrit.
Yeah. So sneha is usually, sneha word is usually used for mother to the child. So it says that in Sanskrit also we use that word, I think for Bhagavan also, that they have used word, anyways, that word is used like the way the cow is loving their calf. The way mother loves their child, same way the sneha is related to any materialistic or anything like that. So that is the word sneha, the love word, which is unconditional. Yeah.
And you explain the word spruha.
Spruha, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so yeah, spruha is, yeah. So sneha, as I said, which is unconditional. Spruha, which you have, again conditions, but spruha which you want to fulfill some desires. So sneha and spruha, sneha has no expectations, which we said unconditional. Spruha has some expectations. So usually they say that between husband and wife, it is spruha. That means they have love, but there might be some conditions or maybe some expectations from each other. And the sneha were used from between mother and their child, that there is no expectations or where there is no conditions. So yeah, so these are two different words.
And maybe you should also explain Shubh, Sukh,
Yeah.
Shubha and Dukh
Yeah, Shubha.
while you're here.
So Shubha word is, I always say that it is one of the most complicated words to understand, which we always translate Shubha is auspicious. But Shubha again, which has more positive vibes, as we call. Like sometimes we use a word that the Ganga river. We say that Ganga river, maybe the water of the Ganges river might be dirty, but it is auspicious. So Shubha used for auspiciousness or maybe that positive vibes. And there are two another words which we call Sukham and Dukkham. So usually we explain word Sukham. It says that Sukha has means happy, has one word which is negative or opposite word of sukha, which is dukkha. So happiness has opposite word of unhappiness, which is sukha, has opposite word of dukkha. That means they both are not permanent. Which has opposite word of that, usually in Sanskrit we say that is not permanent, but there is another word beyond that which we call ananda. Now in Sanskrit, ananda word has no opposite word. So anand means, we can translate as joy, but anand which is also kind of happiness, but which happiness stays permanently in any condition. So yeah, so these are the different words.
So having understood those words, Bhagavan then says one who remains unattached, without affection in all mindsets. Now, we've seen before that by unattached, Bhagavan does not at all mean somebody who does not care for other people. So the words without affection are not used in this context. He means a person without affection or attachment to the results of their actions, is what he means here. In other words, one who doesn't carry out actions wanting a specific, predetermined or pre-chosen, I should say, outcome, for which the person has a great affection or a great attachment. This is what I want to happen. Also, a person who does not become attached or have affection for sense objects. So this is shown when we use expressions like, I love the new iPhone. That is an expression of affection for an inanimate object. And that's what Bhagavan is referring to here. A good example of such attachment we can get from the business world. Let's have a look at it. A contractor comes in, carries out the project he's hired for, and he moves on. He's a person who's outside the company. He has no real connection to the company, but he's employed for or used for a specific project. When the contractor completes the project, they basically simply close the project down and they move on. Now, an employee joins the same company to carry out similar projects. So the company decides, well, this isn't just one project we needed the subcontractor for or a contractor for. We have many, so it's far better for us to have an employee do this than constantly call in a contractor. It'll be more cost effective to have an employee. So an employee comes in. But now the employee is immediately entangled in the business politics. They start thinking about who to befriend, how to move into his boss's position. Whose help will I need in order to move on in the company? He is now attached or stuck to. He's now become attached. The contractor was not attached. He was not in the slightest bit interested in all these questions of politics. How shall I move up the ladder? Who should I work for? Not interested. But again, this refers to a balanced person. And we've seen we're never in a position to decide whether something that happens is good or bad. And we will keep, unfortunately, coming back to this idea time and again in the Gita, because Bhagavan will keep coming back to this issue. So this doesn't mean that something happens and we perceive it to be good. We don't feel satisfied. So we build a school to educate poor children, and the school is completed 1 month ahead of schedule. Should we not feel satisfied? No, Bhagavan is not saying you don't feel satisfied. He's merely saying we're not attached to that result. Does it mean that when something happens which we perceive as being not good, we're not concerned to try to correct the outcome? So taking the same example, we're building a school and the contractors tell us the school is going to be 3 months late. Does that mean that we will not be concerned and take corrective action? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Of course we will. Any sensible person will try to take corrective action. To say, okay, but the whole school will not be completed. Could we get some of the classrooms complete? Which ones can you complete? So no, he's not again saying that we will not take such corrective action. Bhagavan is referring to balance. So we don't lose our balance and start yelling at the contractors. We don't start saying, this is what I get for all my efforts. I'm abandoning the school. I really don't care. If you guys couldn't make the effort, I don't care. Because the person is not an unbalanced person. So they don't have very positive feelings when they have good fortune. They don't have very negative feelings when they get a result that they really didn't particularly want. And we've noted the Sanskrit words used by Bhagavan are both more than just sukh and dukh, which refer to just like and dislike. He's used stronger words which indicate greater stability, even when outcomes are what we view as positive or negative. And throughout our life, it'll come our ways. I was saying to somebody a few days ago, the universe will always throw you curveballs. If you can't accept those curveballs, you're going to go through your life feeling very miserable or very happy, whichever, but you're not going to go through your life balanced because there's no way to avoid the curveballs. We don't have the full picture of anything, so we should stop trying to label things good or bad as outcomes. Then he says it's a person who has fixed or stable permanent knowledge. Again, in this verse, he's trying to answer a different question: how to recognize such an individual. He says if somebody has these qualities of mind, we should consider them to be someone with proper knowledge and a stability coming from that understanding. Yeah? So you can take that person as being somebody with that stable knowledge.
Yeah. Verse 58. Yada samharati chayam kurmongani vasarvashah indriyani indriyarthebhyas tasya pragya pratisthita. Bhagavan says now, yada, when, samharate, restrain, cha ayam, of these, kurmaha angani iva sarvashah. Kurma is tortoise, angani means part of body, sarvashah free means from everywhere. So Bhagavan says the way tortoise restrain their part of body as soon as any objects come front of that. Same way, whose intellect is steady, Bhagavan says, indriyani indriyarthebhyah. Indriya is sense, artha means object. Bhagavan says, as soon as the person sees any object, their senses are getting restrained. As tortoise see any objects, the way tortoise restrain their senses, same way, whose intellect is steady, they restrain their senses from their objects. Yeah. So one is giving an example of tortoise here. Yeah.
So he's giving quite a difficult example. He says, one who is able to withdraw the senses from their objects naturally, just as a tortoise withdraws its limbs into its shell, is fixed in knowledge with a steady intellect. So he's now talking of withdrawing our senses from their objects. In the case of the eyes, it's pretty easy. We close the eyes, they've got lids. We simply close them and now you're dissociated from vision. But in the case of our ears, we can go to a quiet place where there's no noise. We can put in earplugs, but it's not quite as easy to cut off noise. In a quiet place, similarly, no one will touch us, so we will not be using the sense of touch either. So in other words, it is possible to isolate ourselves to the maximum extent possible so that the outside world is not impinging on our senses. But Bhagavan is actually meaning much more. He is referring to the ability to focus the mind away from the sense objects. This is much harder to do. Bhagavan will come to the issue of how to do this in later chapters, especially chapter 6. For now, right now, he's simply telling Arjuna that somebody who is able to do this is one who has wisdom and knowledge. The critical thing we have to understand here, and this example of the tortoises will come back again and again. Now, both of us are in Florida, so we see tortoises very regularly, and the instant they sense something, what do? Immediately all the limbs go in. The head, the two limb, they head straight back into the shell. Okay. It's natural. It's not that the tortoise thinks about, did the shell I do it? It's automatic. Bhagavan is saying, withdrawal from the senses for you should be as automatic as that. The instant you sense any danger, that something is going to impinge on my senses, which I don't want to impinge on it. Somebody who's able to do this, he says, has wisdom and knowledge. Now, part of our ability to do this is going to depend on how well we understand that the world outside is just a mirage, hologram, whatever expression we want to use. It's based on energy waves, which our senses interpret as different objects. If we still don't understand that, it's good to go back to the two-slit experiment in the earlier verse of chapter 2 and reread that and do a bit more research on it, because physics tells us the same thing. It's giving us the same message. He's asking us to reach a stage by giving the example of the tortoise, where our withdrawal from the sense objects and our understanding is as natural and automatic as that tortoise. We withdraw the senses not just from something that displeases us, but also something that pleases us, to which we might now get unduly attached. So he's not saying withdraw it when something that you dislike is seen or happens. He's saying be detached from your senses at all times. So clearly he's advising, whenever there's any object or situation that's going to disturb our equanimity, withdraw your mind from that, he's saying. So if we have a sweet tooth and we find it difficult to control, it's not advisable for us to keep a box of chocolates by our bedside or at the dining table. He's saying, no, don't keep it there. There's a beautiful poem by Rudyard Kipling, If, which actually summarizes this beautifully, which I'll read out, because it's such a good poem illustrating this very fact. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hate, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think, not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and build them up with worn-out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run. Yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and what is more, you'll be a man, my son. Beautifully captures the essence. Yeah? He must have read the Gita, I reckon. Because it beautifully captures the essence of everything. Yeah? That you can mix with kings and yet be able to mix with
Common touch. Yeah.
Anybody. Yeah? Yeah. You can dream, but not allow the dreams to start being your master. Yeah? Exactly. That I have to run after my dream. Yeah? It's a beautiful poem, man. I love that one. Anyway, verse 59.
Verse 59. Vishaya vinivartante niraharasya dehinah rasavarjam rasopyasya param drashtva nivartate. Bhagavan says, Vishaya vinivartante. Vishaya means the objects of senses. Vinivartante, they get restrained. Niraharasya dehinah. So nirahara means who's, so ahara means usually when you enjoy or want what you eat. But here means what you enjoy. Nirahara means who has come off or who has overcome to those all objects or the enjoying of those all objects. That is called nirahara, which who has overcome to all those. Dehina means the person. He says rasavanajam without desire. Rasam rasaha api asya. Rasaha means again desire. So Bhagavan says the person has no desire, who has the objects of senses, they have those are restrained by itself, and by doing that, param drishtva nivartate. Param is again where Bhagavan is talking about the moksha, which we call Brahma. Drishtva means after seeing or realizing, nivartate, they cease or they come back. So even though, so as we say that when you try to restrain your senses while seeing Rasagulla, but you are keep thinking of that, you will come back and you have that Rasagulla. So one says that you might restrain front of everyone just to make yourself comfortable, but you are keep thinking of that. So one says that also you will come back and have that. So this is what meaning of this.
Jiniji is talking from experience that we see a rasgulla, then we thinking about it, come back to it.
No, actually, so one I didn't have that in my mind, but once you want to say Rasagulla at the beginning, now my Rasagullas keep going inside in my mind.
Change it to jalebi, it's fine.
Exactly.
So Bhagavan says, and he's moved away now slightly from Arjun's original question, how do I recognize such a person? He's moved away from the person who already has achieved that equanimity of mind to somebody who is seeking it. Because the word he uses is aspirants. He says, aspirants may practice. So seekers may practice pulling back the senses from their objects of enjoyment, but the desire for sense object remains. However, the person who sees the supreme knowledge never comes back to a stage of having desires. So the person who's achieved it never comes back to the stage of having desires, but the aspirant is still seeking that stage or that equanimity of mind. So what is he explaining here? What's he trying to get at? What he's trying to say is that when we start on this path, we may simply restrain our thoughts from thinking about some sense objects. But our liking of and wanting those objects remains unchanged. So our likes and our dislikes will remain unchanged. We are simply trying to draw our mind away from that. Exactly as Junichi says, we may eat one rasgulla, so we restrain our senses, but we still hanker after the other four, or however many. But our scriptures say we should be like a spoon, as an example Junichi gave. The spoon goes into dal or shrikhand, it remains the same. The spoon doesn't care what it goes into. It remains a spoon. And he's saying we should live in the world like that. You're in the world, just as a spoon is indifferent into what it is, we should be indifferent in whether we are put into good or bad circumstances. The pot I'm being dumped in, is it a good one? I like it. This pot I'm being dumped in and dunked in, I don't like it. But he said you should remain the same. He wants us to get to the stage where, because we've understood the ultimate truth of all things, the ultimate reality, we don't even hanker after the things of the senses, whether they're rasgullas or anything else. Obviously, this is much harder for us to achieve. And Bhagavan is not saying anywhere that it's easy. Why is it so hard for us to achieve? Let's look at it. Now, when we see something we like and which gives us pleasure, our brain releases dopamine. There's research published by the Coleman Institute shows that large amounts of dopamine are released when two things happen. We think about a pleasurable experience, or there's a realistic opportunity that we will be able to have the pleasurable experience, or true anticipation. So in either of these circumstances, the brain releases dopamine, and now it becomes difficult to resist that temptation. Dopamine is only released when the brain associates an object, a person or activity with something pleasurable, something we like. For those who have understood the reality and don't connect sense objects with any pleasure, there'll naturally be no release of dopamine. So for them, because there's no release of dopamine, they will have dopamine continuously released when they think of Paramatma. That's what is going to give them real pleasure, and immediately dopamine is released, and that's why they're in a state of realization which gives them permanent happiness or permanent joy. They, no matter what happens, they seem happy. Yeah.
So verse 60. Yatato hyapi kaunteya purushascha vipaschitah indriyani pramathini haranti prasabham manaha. So now Bhagavan says, Yatatah api kaunteya. Kaunteya is the son of Kunti. Yatataha. Yatata means who is keep practicing. Purushasya vipaschitah. The person who is practicing. Vipaschitah means who is intellect. But Bhagavan is saying for them also, Indriyani pramathini. He says the senses are so strong. Pramathanam means which is keep churning. Haranti prasabham manaha. He says, again, haranti is, I think, you can say kidnapping or distracting. He says, haranti prasabham manaha. Those senses are churning, and because of that, it is distracting prasabham manaha. Prasabham, which is again very strong mind also. So even though the person who is intellect, who is practicing, but still because of the senses which are strong enough to churn the same objects in the mind, so that mind is distracting or getting distracted by objects.
So Bhagavan now admits the senses are so strong and agitated, O son of Kunti, that they can distract the mind even of a person endowed with a high and steady intellect. In other words, even if we've achieved a steady intellect, there may be circumstances which will still, despite that, disrupt our equilibrium. Our senses, what do? They link, what's their job? It's to link the external world to our brain. They carry information about physical stimulus to our brains. The brain then processes it, interprets it, enables us to react to our surroundings. Typically, we consider we have 5 senses: vision, hearing, touch, smell, taste. We have various sensory receptors. We have neurons, for example, in our retina, other neurons in our nose that enable us to smell. The response of these sensory neurons is proportional to the intensity of the stimulus. It's not proportional only to the number of neurons, it's also proportional to the intensity of that stimulus. So a bright light will activate neurons much more strongly in the retina than a dim light. So a very strong stimulus can affect the brain. Now, our sensory systems are also designed to detect change. So if a stimulus is long-lasting, like a light staying on, we begin to actually notice it, perceive it less and less, because our sensory systems adapt. So there is a very good example of an illusion. And if you basically Google illusion circling purple dots, you'll be able to find it on Google. And basically, if you Google that, you'll find that there are dots which appear to be circling round and round, small purple dots going round and round a circle. But if you stare at the center of the image for long enough, these purple or lilac dots fade, and it leaves a single green dot circling a gray background. There never was any circling purple dots. That's because our visual system is adapting. The stationary image fades, we only perceive the path that changes. So, if we are ourselves stable, our brain adapts to the stimulus. Even a person who practices discrimination and is self-controlled is still affected by their senses. We can't help it because we have our senses. And they too will see the lilac dots. So it doesn't matter whether you are a controlled person, self-realized, it doesn't matter who you are, you're going to see the purple dots because you still have your senses. But as you calmly stay with it, the lilac dots fade and the brain adapts. So in other words, one sees through an illusion by staying with that illusion and understanding what's underlying it. So this is the first clue that Bhagavan gives. How will you understand that what you're looking at is not the reality? And he's saying focus on that. What you think is a reality, try and look behind it. Exactly what we did with the circling dots. We stayed with this illusion. I've got these dots circling round and round. You stayed with it and then realized there are no circling dots. Sri Krishna is here responding to the thought we may have that if we have controlled our actions and we're not eating the rasgulla, what difference does it make if we're thinking of one? He's saying if you keep thinking of it, at some point your senses will get disturbed and you will eat one. That's why he's asking us to control our senses. Because at some point or another you will have a moment of weakness, and no matter how strong you are, you will give in to that weakness sometime or another. So he's basically saying, get over your weakness by controlling your senses. Well, there's a lot to take in those verses, so we'll leave it here for today. And next week we'll go into verses 61 and on. And we will nearly have completed the chapter. And the last 10 or 11 verses are actually some of the most interesting. We'll come to them next time. Thank you so much for listening. Jai Shri Krishna.
Jai Shri Krishna.